Hey guys, Saeed here. Welcome to Psychology of Spirituality. So in today's video series, we're going to delve into Indigenous psychology. What is it? What is the difference between mainstream and Indigenous psychology, post-colonial theory, and then extrapolating it into my book chapter, which is going to be about positive psychology and through an Indigenous Islamic framework. So firstly, let's begin with the term self-actualization. We've all heard of this term, right? It's entered our lexicon, our culture. I hear celebrities talk about this. I hear athletes talk about this term. Abraham Maslow wrote a seminal paper in 1943 titled Theory of Human Motivation, which outlined this pyramid that we're familiar with. This propensity to become more than our current iterations, driven by our career, our passion, our creative interests, our business model, our intrinsic fuel, we actualize to the distal land of giants, the Einsteins, the Michael Jordans, the Rockefellers, the Jay-Z's, the Obamas, the Trumps. We want our own piece of the pie and recognition as those who transcend above and beyond the beleaguered and meager lives of the unmotivated, unpassionate, unbeknownst, unfettered, and underhanded attempts of a life worth living. But if we probe a little bit deeper as to how this term has come to evolve and shape our psychology through these language games which drive our behavior, we can see a different trajectory altogether for the development of an entire subdiscipline of psychology, and consequently our mental representations of this term. Abraham Maslow visits the Blackfoot Reserve in 1938. It is reported on a number of accounts that the bulk of his idea behind self-actualization comes from his conversation with the Blackfoot elder Narcisse Blood, including in his own unpublished archives.
When they arrive at Siksika, what training do they have that has prepared them for what they're going to do? They're only going to spend 6 weeks in the community. What are they going to get in 6 weeks? Do they know the language? Do they know anything about the culture of the community? Maslow says, I got my social personality index here, right? I'm going to sit down and go through this with people. And so he starts doing this, right? He starts sitting with, first he started with the elders, and in his unpublished paper, he writes about this, and he says they stonewalled him. They said they looked at him like they didn't understand the questions or why he was possibly asking the questions he did. Even in the first part, he would never even get to the second part of the questions with the elders. Just in the first part, where they're being prompted to speak bad about people, other people, to rate themselves in comparison to others, they weren't going to do it. They just refused.
Maslow listens to what Narcisse is telling him, but he cannot truly encapsulate the heart of what is being offered by this indigenous tradition. The core of what existence means, being shaped so deeply by the socio-cultural fabric of our identities and our inherited worlds. For Maslow and for other Western psychologists, psychology as a means to become smarter, sharper, more intelligent, more lucrative, more driven, more productive, and hopefully as a secondary byproduct, to become more satisfied, more fulfilled, more happy. But what does existence mean for the Blackfoot tribe and for Narcisse Blood? The self not as the central figure in this puzzle of life, each person striving to express themselves only in relation to service of the community, to their ancestors, to the future children and lineage which will inherit their gods and totems, and the planet which houses creatures and planets which also serve as our brothers and sisters. The pyramid is reformulated as a relational model, a model open for all, at all times, including the poor, the hungry, the desolate. Those without materialistic or social status can transform their spiritual potentialities as vibrantly as those who have materialistic gains. Perhaps even more so, as it tells us in the Holy Bible.
That they diminish, indigenous knowledge systems, other than calling it cultural, is to call it spiritual, right? Spiritual. So when I look at Atsumoiskan, I always like to point out, this is spiritual. But what are we talking about here? We're talking about things that you can go outside and look up in the sky and actually see, the sun, the source of our life. This is calling to all of the life in the air, all of the life on the land, all of the life that's underwater.
Holy Bible. I want to use this analogy as the backdrop for a series of videos which will delve into indigenous psychology and culminate with my final video, which is paired with my first book chapter on an indigenous Islamic approach to positive psychology. For those who may not know, Abraham Maslow is viewed as the father and the founder of humanistic and positive psychology, and this self-actualization model is one of the most enduring paradigms used in all disciplines. It's also important to note that in the later part of his life, Maslow replaced self-actualization with self-transcendence, which is better, but it's still antithetical when it comes to many spiritual approaches. And here I'm linking a video with Dr. Aronson where we speak about the concept of sunyata and anatta, this no-being category, and nothingness concept at the heart of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This idea of a self ultimately being an illusion which constantly perpetuates itself, leading to enhanced suffering. Maslow also began including plateau experiences, not simply peak experiences, after many rightfully criticized his approach as being elitist, like only the rich and powerful can actualize because they've reached that level of getting enough materialistic comfortability. But where does that lead to? What is the means and what is the ends? And I have talked at length about this recontextualization, even how our measurements of success are all rooted in materialistic gains such as GDP or gross net. And as such, these indigenous tools, mindfulness, which is used to destroy the ego initially in its indigenous form, in this free-form spirituality movement, this constant search of finding oneself, meditating, doing yoga, quoting the Buddha, are seen as vehicles to become more calm, more happy, more self-actualized. And the philosophical model I'll be using and alluding to recurrently throughout this video and the future series of videos is Karl Popper's 3 interacting worlds as it relates to just this one concept, self-actualization. We have our first world, right, which is ourselves, our biophysiological states, and the objects and events of our world. These bridge to the second world, our mental processes, how we encode the stimulus in our cognitive patterns, and then our third world, the abstractions gleaned from the first world stimulus and the second world abstractions. We only want to self-actualize because it is a first world problem, and I mean that as a pun and literally. Wanting to better ourselves because it is an idea ingrained in us by our cultural ideals and social institutions. This second world mental image of us as a 2.0 version with a better interface, more features, more calmness, more happy, better business model, a hotter wife, more money in our bank. But at the core of psychology, the study of human behavior, what is the methodology driving this? What is the third world abstraction which presents to us a satisfied life, a life worth living? Is it self-actualization? Is it complete obliteration of the self? As this is endorsed not only in Buddhism but also in Islam, as I've talked about here in relation to fana, a Sufi concept of obliteration of one's soul in the oasis of Allah, or maybe even a middle pathway between the two. So this was just the introduction. I can't speak about every single indigenous framework, right? Each of them is different. I don't want to homogenize all of them. This is going to be more of a framework which helps us understand what modern psychology is, right? Where it came from, the political, historical stance of modern psychology, and bridging it with indigenous psychology framework, using Richard Katz's book, Indigenous Healing Psychology, to offer what it is that indigenous psychology, right? These ancestral pasts that we seem to just discard as archaic, what they can do to offer our profession, our discipline, and ultimately this job, this role of trying to better ourselves and elevate our consciousness. Thirdly, critiquing mainstream psychology as it relates to multiculturalism, right? This heavy emphasis on white privilege, anti-racism, racial ethnic affiliation, with very little call for systemic efforts, particularly with emphasis on a spiritual basis for existence. And fourthly, examining the critiques behind this post-colonial stance of indigenous wisdom, right? It's very important for us to look at the other side as well. What are we left with when it comes to psychology, right? We need some sort of firm footing in an empirical methodology. And lastly, delving into my upcoming book chapter, what does positive psychology offer us? How is being better and doing better approached from an Islamic standpoint? So this is going to be a multi-part series, and I am using two main texts, Richard Katz's Indigenous Healing Psychology and Emil Durkheim's Elementary Forms of Religion, which focuses on the collective representations of faith in the Aboriginal societies. I would also mention King's book, The Inconvenient Indian, which offers a much more prescient, relevant application of indigenous people in modern North America.